Ready to dive into some of the nitty-gritty on emissions data? We're going to dig into the Banff Protocol today, and trust me, by the time we're done with this deep dive, you are going to be armed to the teeth with knowledge for those big meetings coming up.
Absolutely. And this isn't just some boring policy talk. This is about how we as a planet measure our impact and keep each other accountable for a greener future.
Okay, so we hear all the time about companies, governments, you name it, making huge promises about going green, right? But how do we actually measure if they're making progress? And how do we make sure these pledges aren't just, greenwashing?
That is the question, isn't it? And it gets right to the heart of why this Banff Protocol is causing such a stir. Because right now, it's like the Wild West out there. Everyone's doing their own thing when it comes to reporting emissions, using different methods, different definitions, and trying to compare that data. It's almost impossible.
So it's like everyone's speaking a different language.
Exactly. It's a total Tower of Babel situation. And listen, this isn't just an academic issue. It has real consequences. Imagine you're an investor, right? And you want to put your money into a company that's truly committed to sustainability. But trying to wade through all that data, it's like navigating a minefield. This lack of a common language, it breeds skepticism, it slows down real progress, and it costs everybody, companies, investors, the public, a ton of time and money.
It sounds incredibly inefficient.
Yeah.
Does the document actually put a price tag on all this inconsistency?
It does. The RM Foundation actually found that, get this, companies are spending an average of $533,000 every single year just on disclosing their climate stuff.
Wow.
Think about that. That's a mid-sized manufacturer, right?
They're trying to compare emissions from a plant they have in, say, Germany with one in Brazil, but they're each using different standards. Just making sense of that data could eat up a huge chunk of their budget before they even get to actually reducing their impact.
Okay, yeah, that really drives home the problem.
Yeah.
So is that where this Banff protocol comes in, like swooping in to save the day? You got it. The protocol, it's like, imagine a universal translator for all this emissions data. So we're talking about establishing these clear, consistent standards for how we define, measure, and report emissions. It's about bringing that much-needed transparency and trustworthiness to the whole system.
And this all kind of kicked off at COP28, right?
Okay.
With all those big climate pledges flying around, it makes sense you need accurate data if you're actually going to achieve those goals.
It's no coincidence, that's for sure. The document specifically talks about those big commitments from the UAE and the World Bank. We're talking billions of dollars pledged to combat climate change. With that much on the line, knowing those investments are actually making a difference is critical.
It's true. You can't manage what you can't measure.
Yeah.
So how does this Banff Protocol actually work in practice? Are they like laying down the law for everyone to follow?
It's more collaborative than that, actually. PPDM, the organization behind all this, they're bringing together all the players. Industry experts, people from governments, climate scientists, you name it. And they're all coming together to develop best practices, training, resources, that kind of thing.
So it's like a one-stop shop for all things emissions data.
Exactly. A central hub. They're building this whole data framework. They're creating competency programs so everyone's speaking the same language, so to speak. They even offer tech resources to help companies actually implement these new standards.
That's incredibly ambitious. What's the timeline on all of this?
They're aiming to get the core stuff done within 2 years. Although, and the document makes this clear, this is an ongoing process. Because emissions reporting, it's constantly changing, right? New technologies pop up, our scientific understanding evolves, so staying up to date is key.
Right, so this isn't a one-and-done kind of deal. But even with the best of intentions, there are always going to be challenges, right? So what are some of the hurdles that the Banff Protocol might encounter along the way?
One of the biggest ones, honestly, getting everyone on board. Because right now it's voluntary. So its success hinges on companies, investors, regulators. They all have to buy in.
It's like trying to convince the Wild West to embrace, well, civilization. I mean, everyone benefits from clear rules, a level playing field, but old habits die hard.
You said it. And that's not even the whole picture. There's another really interesting thing the document highlights.
Ooh, okay, I'm intrigued. What is it?
They specifically talk about the need to support indigenous equity partnerships as part of this whole process.
Really? That's not something you hear every day in this context. Why is that so important for something like emissions reporting?
Well, think about it. Who's often on the front lines of climate change? Indigenous communities. They have this incredible depth of knowledge about sustainable practices passed down over generations, bringing them to the table. It's invaluable.
That's a perspective I hadn't even considered, but it makes so much sense. If you want to build a truly effective system, it needs to be inclusive and tap into that wealth of knowledge.
Absolutely. And that's just scratching the surface. We're going to be unpacking a lot more about the Banff Protocol, the good, the bad, and everything in between.
I'm ready to keep digging. We've laid some groundwork, right? Explored the problem, introduced a potential solution. But what does it all mean in the grand scheme of things? What are the benefits, the potential downsides? That's what we'll be tackling when we come back. Welcome back. So in part one, we really got into the weeds on the need for standardized emissions data and how this Banff Protocol is trying to tackle that. But you can't talk about something this big without addressing the potential downsides, right? So what are some of the challenges the Banff Protocol might face as it tries to move from like an idea to something real, something concrete?
You're right. It's not all sunshine and rainbows, right? The document itself actually does a good job of highlighting some of the hurdles. One of the biggies, and I think this is no surprise, is the sheer complexity of emissions reporting. We're talking about data coming from everywhere, different industries, different countries, all these variables.
So how do you even begin to wrangle all of that into some kind of standardized format? It seems like herding cats.
It's a huge undertaking, no doubt. Even if everyone agrees on the principles, which is a big if, then you have the whole challenge of implementation. Smaller companies, especially those without a lot of resources or expertise, they might really struggle to adapt.
So instead of leveling the playing field, it could actually create a bigger gap.
Right.
The big players with deep pockets, they adapt, but smaller businesses are left behind.
That's definitely a concern, and the document does acknowledge that. The whole idea of providing support and resources to developing countries and smaller businesses is key. They know that a one-size-fits-all approach isn't going to cut it. Accessibility and inclusivity have to be part of the equation.
It's about bringing everyone along, not just dictating from on high. But are there other potential drawbacks we need to think about? What about innovation? I've heard some people say that this kind of strict standardization could actually stifle creativity in the long run.
That's a really interesting point. There's this argument that if you set rigid rules for emissions reporting, companies are going to be so focused on checking boxes, on compliance, that they'll be less likely to try new things, to push boundaries.
So instead of a spirit of innovation, it's more like, how do I make sure I'm following the rules? And that's it.
Yeah, that's a valid concern, for sure. And it highlights how crucial it is for the Banff Protocol to strike the right balance. But on the flip side, some experts argue that this standardized data could actually become a driver of innovation.
Really? How so? That seems counterintuitive.
Think about it this way. When everyone's on the same page, data-wise, when you can actually compare apples to apples, so to speak, it becomes a lot easier to spot trends, to see where the opportunities for innovation lie.
So instead of everyone operating in their own little silos reinventing the wheel, they can actually learn from each other's successes and even their failures.
Precisely. Transparency and collaboration, those are the engines of progress. Remove all that noise of inconsistent data, and suddenly the path to meaningful innovation becomes a lot clearer.
I hadn't thought about it like that. It really changes the whole conversation, right?
Right.
Instead of viewing standardization as a limit, it could actually be a starting point for new solutions.
Exactly. And that brings us to what I think is maybe the most important piece of the puzzle. And honestly, this goes for any big challenge we're facing, the human element.
Let's talk about that. Because we could have all the data in the world, all the best laid plans, but if we're not considering the people who are actually collecting this information, interpreting it, acting on it, then what's the point?
Couldn't agree more. Data, even standardized data, is only as good as the people using it.
Right. It's not enough for this Banff protocol to just exist, right?
Yeah.
People need to understand it, believe in it, and actually use it effectively.
100%. The document actually stresses how important education and training are, especially in developing nations. It's about giving people the knowledge and the skills they need, not just to understand the data, but to actually drive change in their communities.
It's about making sure people are data literate, right?
Well,
being able to look at information, even complex information, and know what they're seeing. But it's more than just the technical skills, isn't it? It's also about a sense of responsibility.
you've hit the nail on the head. Climate change, sustainability. These aren't just about technology, they're about people. We've talked about the potential benefits, the possible pitfalls, but let's zoom out for a second. Let's look at the big picture.
Okay, big picture. What if, and this is a tough question, what if, despite our best efforts, we can't avert the worst effects of climate change? In that scenario, does something like the Banff Protocol even matter?
The big existential questions. Those are the ones that keep me up at night.
Maybe not every night, but it's definitely something to think about.
It is. And it's a reality check, right? The Banff Protocol, as promising as it is, It's not a magic bullet.
It's one piece of a much, much larger puzzle.
Exactly. And its success depends on so many factors, some of which are completely out of our control.
It's both empowering and humbling at the same time. Like, we have the power to make a difference, but we're also kind of at the mercy of these forces that are bigger than all of us.
That's the paradox of being human, right?
Well said. We've covered a lot of ground here. But for our listeners who aren't, scientists or policymakers, but who care deeply about the planet, what does this all mean? How do we take all this information and figure out how we can contribute?
That is the million-dollar question, and it's something we're going to delve into when we come back for the third and final part of our deep dive.
All right, we're back. So we've spent this whole deep dive really getting into the nitty-gritty of this Banff Protocol, the good, the bad, the potential, everything. But now, let's bring it all home.
Exactly. We've looked at the big picture, but let's zoom in on you. How can this new protocol empower you as an individual to make smarter choices about sustainability?
That's what I really want to know. Because honestly, it's easy to feel overwhelmed by this stuff.
Sure, right.
Climate change is such a huge issue. What can one person even do?
Well, think back to that core aim of the Banff Protocol, making things transparent, right? Standardized data. That is a game changer for everyday consumers.
You mean it'll be easier to spot companies that are just greenwashing? Like, no more falling for those vague promises and fancy marketing campaigns?
Exactly. When everyone plays by the same rules, data-wise, you can actually compare companies, see their environmental track record side by side. It's like having a nutritional label, but for their sustainability claims.
Oh, I like that. So instead of just taking their word for it, we can actually look at the data and make informed decisions about what we buy, where we invest our money.
Exactly. You become a more conscious consumer, and that sends a message. You support the companies that actually align with your values. And think about it, this transparency can fuel much more informed public conversations about climate action in general.
So no more debating about whether climate change is real or not. We can actually move past that and talk about solutions.
That's the idea. Having this accurate, standardized data, it makes it a lot harder to deny the science or spread misinformation. It gives everyone a common starting point for real dialogue, for making smarter decisions, whether it's in our communities or on a global scale.
Having that shared understanding is huge. You can't solve a problem if everyone's working with a different set of facts. But this Banff Protocol, it's not just about keeping corporations in check or influencing policy, right? Are there lessons here that we can apply to our own lives, even in a small way?
Absolutely. And one of the biggest ones, and this has been a theme throughout our whole conversation, is the importance of data literacy.
Okay, data literacy. For those of us who aren't scientists or data analysts, what does that actually look like in our everyday lives?
It's simpler than you might think. It's about being able to understand data, to look at a chart or a graph and get what it's saying, to think critically about information, especially these days when we're bombarded with it constantly.
And that's even more important when it comes to something as complex as climate change, right? There's so much information out there, it's easy to get lost.
Exactly. Caring isn't enough. We need to be equipped to look at that information, that data, and figure out what's real, what's not, what sources we can trust, to make decisions based on evidence.
So even though this whole Banff Protocol thing is really aimed at these big institutions, it highlights how important it is for everyone to be data literate.
It's a life skill. And these skills, critical thinking, being able to evaluate information, spot bias, those are valuable no matter what you're doing, whether you're reading a sustainability report or just scrolling through the news.
It's like working out a muscle, that critical thinking muscle, and you can use it everywhere.
And, the more we exercise that muscle, the more we can inspire others to do the same, right? It creates a ripple effect where we start demanding more transparency, more accountability in all areas of our lives.
Be the change you want to see, as they say.
It's true. And sometimes that change starts with just being able to understand a statistic or questioning where a piece of information came from. That's the power of knowledge. And honestly, it's what this whole Banff Protocol is trying to do. It's about making information accessible, giving people the tools to make informed choices.
It really drives home the point that even with something as massive and complex as climate change, we all have a role to play.
We do. It's about collective action, but that starts with individual awareness, understanding, and action. Every little bit counts.
That's a great note to end on. We've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive, from the challenges to the incredible potential of this Banff Protocol.
It's an evolving situation, no doubt. The jury's still out on whether it'll achieve everything it sets out to do. But the conversation, It started. That's crucial. Staying informed, staying engaged, that's what matters.
Absolutely. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive into the Banff Protocol. We hope you learned something, that you feel empowered to learn more, and maybe even a little bit inspired to make a difference. Until next time, stay curious.